They were 14 to 63, with labels that read like punishments, melancholia, shell shock, hysteria. Families still repeat the words they were told: she was transferred, but no one can say where. The morning light seeped through grimy windows, weak and gray against the yellowed paint of the ward. Dust motes drifted in the stagnant air, stirred only by the faint hum of fluorescent tubes that buzzed like trapped insects. Somewhere down the corridor, a single voice carried a woman's, sharp, deliberate, almost mechanical in tone. She was reading from a list, her cadence that of ritual more than care. Delaney, Ruth. Silence. Voss, Carl. Silence. Hammond, Joseph. Silence again. Each name echoed down the corridor and faded into nothing, absorbed by the stillness of the empty rooms. Not one reply, not a shuffle of feet. Not the nervous cough or mutter that would usually break the monotony of morning roll call, just a voice calling into a void. The camera would linger on the details. A wooden clipboard clutched in one pale hand, the nurse's knuckles whitening as she tapped her pencil against the paper. A doorway where paint had peeled into curling strips. A pair of worn slippers abandoned beneath a bed, their toes pointed outward as if the owner had simply vanished mid-step. In another room, a deck of cards left splayed across a nightstand, the Queen of Spades upturned. Everything frozen in place, preserved, but missing the one thing that should have been constant people. Archival text fades onto the screen in stark white letters. June 14, 1957, Briarvale State Hospital, Pennsylvania. It hangs there, heavy with implication, before dissolving into the faint scrape of pencil on paper as the nurse strikes through another unanswered name. In the records office, a ledger sits open beneath a naked bulb. The camera drifts close, revealing the strange violence done to the book. 52 lines have been sliced out, not torn, not erased, but carved cleanly with a razor blade. The cut edges curl slightly, brittle with age. It is as if the names were surgically excised, as if the act of erasure had been deliberate, not just clerical oversight. Above the mutilated space, one intact line remains, dated and signed by an orderly whose signature still lingers in blue-black ink. Below, the pages resume as though nothing had happened, the handwriting neat, the columns filled, but in the middle a void. The narration slows here, letting the silence breathe, inviting unease. The nurse's voice falters, the pencil trembles, the final name on her list trailing off into silence that swallows her words whole. The wards echo only with the faint hum of the lights and the long, hollow absence of 52 voices that should have answered, but never did. Briarvale State Hospital rose from the Pennsylvania farmland in 1909, a sprawling complex of red brick and limestone intended as both cure and containment. In its earliest days, it was considered a model of progressive psychiatric care, a place where open-air porches and carefully tended gardens were thought to restore troubled minds. The buildings were arranged in a symmetrical plan, a main administration building at the center and long wings stretching out like arms, each filled with wards bathed in sunlight from tall, narrow windows. The grounds were meticulously kept, wide lawns, a small orchard, even a chapel with a modest steeple. But beneath the idealistic architecture, the reality was far harsher. Records from those first years speak of overcrowding within a decade, of patients doubled up in rooms meant for one, of attendants who were often untrained laborers more than caregivers. During World War II, Briarvale expanded rapidly, funded by federal dollars that saw psychiatric hospitals as essential for treating returning soldiers shattered by combat. 2 new wings rose almost overnight, joined by a boiler plant and a network of tunnels to move supplies unseen by the public. The isolation cottages, low brick structures at the far edge of the grounds, were officially intended for patients needing quiet recovery. Unofficially, they became the place where the most difficult cases were locked away, out of sight. The aerial overlays of the campus reveal a web of corridors, tunnels, and outbuildings, an institutional world unto itself. From above, it resembled a fortress more than a hospital, its tall perimeter fence marking a clear line between inside and out. By the mid-1950s, Briarvale was drowning in bodies. Designed for 600 patients, it housed nearly 1-0. Dormitories crammed with iron beds became echo chambers of coughs and whispers. The staff ratio fell to 1 nurse for every 50 patients on some shifts, and the superintendent begged the state for funds that never came. Former employees describe an atmosphere of exhaustion, where the sound of jangling keys and the slam of heavy doors defined the rhythm of each day. The tunnels, meant for efficiency, became shortcuts for orderlies moving patients between wards without the public eye ever catching a glimpse. It was within this maze, in June of 1957, that 52 men and women vanished. No footprints in the mud, no bus records, no trace of transfer, just absence. As the narrator's voice settles over the archival images, the question forms with chilling clarity: how do 52 people leave without a footprint? The camera lingers on the aerial map, tracing the tunnels that vanish beneath the earth, lines on a page leading to nowhere. The hospital stands silent now, but its walls hold a puzzle that has defied explanation for nearly 70 years. The night of June 14th, 1957 began like any other at Briarvale State Hospital, a routine lull between the strict regimens of the day and the uneasy hours before dawn. The night shift logs describe a quiet evening, patients sedated after dinner, attendants making their rounds, and the boiler plant churning steadily below ground. Then, at precisely 2:11 a.m., something broke the monotony. A brief but unmistakable dip in power caused the fluorescent tubes to flicker, plunging the wards into a half-second of darkness before buzzing back to life. The log entry from the switchboard operator is terse. Lights stuttered, unsure if generator interference. A second line, added later in a different hand, simply reads, "Boiler hiss. Unusual pressure release." Within minutes, multiple attendants reported static on the internal phone lines, a harsh crackling that drowned out voices and left only fragments intelligible. One nurse wrote that she tried to call Ward C to confirm medication counts, but heard nothing except a sound like wind rushing through wires. Another log mentions an attempt to contact the boiler room, only to hear a voice repeating her own words back with a delay, as though the line itself had become a kind of echo chamber. By morning, the official explanation would fracture into two competing stories. One incident report claimed there had been an unauthorized evacuation drill, ordered by the superintendent without warning to test staff readiness in the event of fire. The other report, filed the same day but signed by a different supervisor, stated that Ward C had been placed under emergency lockdown due to an unspecified disturbance among the patients. Both documents were stamped and filed, both bore official signatures, and yet they contradicted each other entirely. When investigators later compared them, they noted that the typewriter ink in the evacuation drill report was fresher, darker, as if it had been produced after the fact. The final, verifiable sighting of the vanished patients came from two attendants stationed in Ward C. In sworn statements, both men recalled seeing gurneys being wheeled toward the service lift around 2:20 a.m. The patients on those gurneys were covered with blankets up to their chins, motionless but not restrained. The attendants admitted they did not check for themselves who lay beneath the blankets. They were simply following orders to clear the corridor for transfer. One remembered that the elevator descended but never returned, its iron gate left ajar, the light above it burning steadily red. What happened after that remains lost in the silence of conflicting paperwork and half-erased memories. No vehicle logs show patients leaving the grounds. No other wards reported unusual movement. And yet by sunrise, 52 men and women from Ward C were gone. Their beds stripped bare, their names already beginning to vanish from the ledgers. The night shift logs, once routine accounts of pills and patrols, became instead the last fragile record of a disappearance that defies logic even today. In any institution like Briarvale, authority was measured not only in titles but in the heavy rings of keys that clinked at the hips of those who carried them. At the top of that hierarchy was Superintendent Harold Brandt, a former Army medical officer with a reputation for discipline that bordered on severity. Brandt had taken charge of the hospital in 1946 and brought with him a military sense of order, charts logged to the minute, inspections without warning, punishments for staff who broke protocol. To the state, he was the man who kept Briarvale running despite chronic underfunding. To many who worked under him, he was a figure both feared and resented, known to walk the wards at odd hours with his flashlight, always watching, always taking notes in a little leather book no one else was permitted to see. Brandt's personal key ring was said to open every door in the hospital, from the isolation cottages to the tunnel grates beneath the boiler room. Beneath him stood head nurse Lillian Crow, whose name appears again and again in patient files written in sharp, unwavering script. Crow had been with Briarvale since 1929, a fixture in white shoes and pressed uniforms, her stern face instantly recognizable to generations of patients and staff. She carried her keys on a chain tucked discreetly beneath her apron, but it was common knowledge that she guarded the narcotics cabinet with a vigilance that made even physicians defer to her. In staff interviews conducted years later, some recalled her as compassionate but unyielding, a woman who believed order and obedience were the only path to healing. Others described her as secretive, prone to whispering instructions in hallways rather than recording them on paper. On the night of the disappearance, she was logged as present on Ward C, overseeing sedation protocols. No further mention of her appears until the morning, when her own report states bluntly, "Patients transferred per directive." Then there was Otto Gerber, the maintenance chief, a man with grease always under his fingernails and the distinct smell of boiler smoke clinging to his clothes. Gerber had joined Briarvale during the war years, building much of the tunnel system himself, and was said to know more hidden doors and shortcuts than anyone else on staff. His master keys included access to electrical panels, service lifts, and basement storerooms long since forgotten by the administration. Some staff recalled that he kept duplicate sets locked in his workshop, though no inventory was ever produced. On the night of June 14th, the logs place him in the boiler plant, yet a punch clock card bearing his name shows an imprint at 2:09 a.m., 2 minutes before the power dip, then another imprint at 2:09 a.m. Misuse again, as though time itself had stuttered. The second stamp overlaps the first, indistinguishable except for the faint smudge of ink where the card was pressed twice. The question of who held the keys, who could open the wards and wheel patients into the darkened service lift, lingers like the echo of metal striking metal. Brandt with his superintendent's authority, Crow with her command of narcotics and night rounds, Gerber with his tunnels and boiler access, each had the means to move 52 people without a sound. What remains unsettled is whether any one of them acted alone, or whether the keys of Briarvale were turned together, unlocking not just doors but the silence that followed. The vanished were not faceless. They were 52 men and women who had lived within Briarvale's walls, their names scrawled across intake forms, their photographs glued to aging charts, their stories reduced to clinical shorthand. Their ages stretched from 14 to 63. The youngest was Margaret Doyle, a schoolgirl committed after a series of seizures her family could not afford to treat elsewhere. The oldest, Walter Brigg, a former coal miner with tremors and black lung who had been placed in the hospital's care when his wife could no longer lift him from bed. In between were men labeled with shell shock from the Second World War, women diagnosed with melancholia after the loss of children, and others carrying vague, cruel terms of the era: hysteria, degeneracy, nervous disposition. Among them, 3 figures stand out. Ruth Delaney, age 28, had filled her patient notebooks with letters she hoped one day to send to her younger sister. She wrote about the sameness of the days, about the sound of the boiler pipes rattling at night, and about the fleeting friendships made across barred windows and locked doors. Some of her letters survived because a sympathetic nurse smuggled them out in her laundry. The last one ends abruptly in mid-sentence, as though interrupted. Carl Voss, 33, was known to everyone as Radio Carl. Before Briarvale, he had been a factory mechanic and amateur operator. His call sign scribbled into notebooks and even scratched into the underside of his iron bed frame. Staff remembered him rigging wires from the bed springs to try and catch frequencies, insisting he could hear voices not from the ward, but from beyond the hospital walls. Days before his disappearance, an attendant recorded that Carl had grown agitated, repeating the phrase, "turn the faces," over and over as though relaying a message. And then there was Patient X. No photograph, no age listed, no diagnosis in the surviving records. Only a sealed file referenced in the superintendent's logbook. Pages had been cut away, much like the ledger with its 52 missing lines. What fragments remain show annotations in red ink, initials of doctors not otherwise connected to Briarvale, and the cryptic phrase, directive, orientation priority. Families who asked questions were met with silence. One woman recalls being told her sister Ruth had been transferred, though no facility would confirm her arrival. A father of another missing patient said simply, "To where, no one ever said." In interviews decades later, the grief still quivers in their voices, not only for the loss, but for the uncertainty. These were not nameless patients. They were daughters, brothers, fathers, sons' 52 faces erased from the record, leaving only shadows in the halls they once filled. The records room at Briarvale is one of the few spaces in the hospital that still feels untouched by time. Rows of tall metal cabinets stand like soldiers, their drawers labeled in neat block letters, each one a catalogue of lives lived and lost within those walls. The air is thick with the smell of paper left too long in the dark ink, dust, and the faint tang of mildew. At first glance, the room appears perfectly preserved. But when investigators opened the drawers tied to Ward C, they discovered a silence written in absence. Where 52 patient files should have rested, there are only thin gaps, edges too clean to be the result of careless misfiling. The folders had not been misplaced. They had been cut out, removed with precision, as if someone had performed surgery on the archive itself. The ledgers tell a similar story. Forensic specialists, years later, studied the bound books that tracked admissions and discharges. Under magnification, the edges of certain pages revealed fibers consistent with a non-standard blade, something sharper and finer than the utility knives typically used by hospital staff. One analyst noted fibers from a specialized paper knife, the kind sold not to institutions but to clerical offices handling government documents. On the surviving pages, faint traces of carbon ribbon ink stand out, belonging to a typewriter not registered among the hospital's inventory. Someone, it seems, had entered this room with the tools to erase, rewrite, and replace, all without leaving an obvious scar. The registration logs offer perhaps the strangest evidence of tampering. At first, they follow the predictable rhythm of daily admissions: names, diagnoses, ward assignments, physician initials. Then, suddenly, 4 consecutive dates slip out of sequence. The handwriting shifts, slightly but noticeably, the loops of letters tighter, the spacing more deliberate. Under forensic light, investigators uncovered a thin sheen of library glue across the surface of the paper, proof that sections had been pasted over. The dates, at first assumed clerical error, were in fact substitutions entries rewritten to maintain continuity while concealing what was truly recorded there. Standing in the records room today, one cannot help but sense the meticulous effort behind the silence. Someone with knowledge of both the hospital's filing system and the importance of appearances had gone to extraordinary lengths to excise the truth. The files had not been destroyed in haste. They had been deliberately removed, the gaps filled with glue and altered ink, so that, on the surface, everything seemed ordinary. But ordinary paper does not lie forever. The scars remain, faint but undeniable, whispering of the 52 ghosts that once lived inside these cabinets, now absent but not forgotten, erased but not gone. The trail of that June night leads inevitably to the moment when the lights faltered. Utility records pulled decades later show that the town of Briarvale experienced no interruption at all. Street lamps glowed steady, houses stayed lit, and the factories on the river kept running without a hitch. Only the hospital shows an anomaly: 1 minute of unexplained power loss localized entirely to the East Wing, the very section where Ward C was housed. The meter readouts are precise, clocked at 2:11 a.m. The dials register a sudden drop, then a surge, before returning to normal as though nothing had happened. To the outside world, Briarvale never blinked, but inside the hospital, patients and staff were thrown into a momentary void. The testimony of the boiler operator, Otto Gerber, adds a disturbing dimension to the technical report. In an interview conducted during the initial investigation, he described hearing the sudden hiss of pressure valves releasing. He insisted he had not touched them, nor had anyone else been in the plant at that hour. "They spun on their own," he said flatly, as though still unwilling to believe his own memory. "Like backdraft without fire. Steam, but no heat source, no flame. Just the sound of the whole system exhaling at once." He claimed the floor beneath him rattled, as if struck by something massive and unseen, and then fell still the moment the lights stabilized. The official explanation blamed faulty wiring in the generator, a machine already strained by years of overuse. Yet when engineers conducted tests weeks later, they could not replicate the failure. Instead, they stumbled onto something stranger. During a simulated power dip, the emergency generator responded not with the expected hum, but with an irregular rhythm, a strobe of light that pulsed in bursts. A technician monitoring the test recorded the sound, and on tape, a distinct frequency emerged beneath the mechanical noise, an almost musical tone, low and steady, repeating at intervals too precise to be random. The recording was filed away as an artifact of malfunction, yet those who listened closely described the tone as unsettling, something that seemed to echo long after the tape stopped playing. Some whispered it resembled a signal, a deliberate pattern rather than noise. The East Wing's blackout was only a minute, but it left behind ripples, valves that moved without human hands, lights that beat to an alien rhythm, and a frequency that did not belong to any machine on record. Whatever happened at 2:11 a.m., the hospital itself seemed to participate, as if responding to an unseen conductor directing it towards silence. The discovery of the tunnel map came not from state archives or hospital blueprints, but from a box of forgotten papers found in a retired custodian's attic nearly 30 years after the disappearance. Folded neatly among pay stubs and supply orders was a floor plan stamped in bold black ink. Sub, Level B. It depicted a network of passageways extending beneath the East Wing. Tunnels branching off into narrow corridors that did not appear in any of the official documents submitted to state inspectors. The paper bore Briarvale's letterhead, but no filing number, no approval stamp, no indication it had ever been logged. It was a map that wasn't supposed to exist, suggesting that the hospital had grown roots in secret, burrowing into the earth out of sight of oversight. When investigators returned to the grounds with this new information, they traced the map against the current layout of the basement. At first, the walls lined up, the known corridors matching the plan. But then came a discrepancy, a section of blank wall where the map indicated a passage. Dust and debris coated the floor, but under the beam of a flashlight, faint impressions emerged. The outline of wheels, small and narrow like those of gurneys, were pressed into the gray film of neglect. Interspersed with them were the marks of bare feet, toes splayed, uneven, as if dozens had shuffled forward together. All of the prints faced in the same direction, not toward escape, but deeper into the hospital, toward what had once been the root cellar. The cellar itself was an oddity, a vaulted chamber built in the early days to store food, later converted into storage for broken furniture and unused equipment. At its far end stood an arch, its stonework darker than the rest. the surface marred by patches of peeling paint in that distinctive institutional green so common in mid-century hospitals. Beneath the flaking surface, investigators found fresh mortar, pale and crumbly, sealing the arch into a solid wall. The contrast was unmistakable. The surrounding masonry bore the weight and wear of half a century, but the mortar was new, or at least far younger. It suggested that after the disappearance, someone had hastily bricked over whatever lay beyond, concealing it behind layers of paint meant to blend it into the background. The image lingers, wheel tracks vanishing into a sealed archway, barefoot imprints caught forever in the dust, and a hidden map revealing tunnels that no authority ever admitted were there. It raises the question not only of where those passageways led, but why someone went to such careful lengths to bury them in silence. In that sealed arch may lie the path of 52 vanished lives, entombed beneath mortar and paint, waiting for someone to unearth the truth. Ward D was officially recorded as closed in 1953, shut down after state inspectors cited failing plumbing, peeling walls, and overcrowded dormitories. In the paperwork, it was marked as overflow capacity decommissioned, its patients supposedly transferred elsewhere in the hospital. For 4 years, it remained listed in annual reports as sealed and unused. Yet, when investigators compared supply logs from 1956 and 1957, they found a peculiar inconsistency: crates of bread, milk, and dried goods marked for delivery to Ward D, with attendants' initials confirming receipt. These were not occasional errors or misrouted shipments. They were regular entries, suggesting that someone continued to stock a ward the state believed was empty. When researchers overlaid the hospital's official bed census with the number of physical cots counted years later, the numbers refused to align. The ledgers accounted for hundreds of patients, but a discrepancy remained: 52 beds unaccounted for. Walking through the dust-choked rooms of Ward D decades later, investigators noted spaces where cots had clearly once stood, faint rust shadows on the linoleum where metal legs had pressed for years. The numbers matched with an eerie precision: 52 places for bodies that no longer appeared in the census. 52 absences unacknowledged by the administration. The ward itself bore other strange marks of concealment. In one corridor, an observation window looked down into a dormitory space. It should have been clear glass for monitoring patients, but instead it was clouded with an opaque film. Testing later revealed the frosting was not the result of time or natural decay, but a chemical treatment deliberately applied to the inside surface. From the hallway, no one could see in. From within, however, the patients would have seen only a blank white glare, robbed of the comfort of knowing they were being watched. The treatment was uneven in places, drips hardened along the edges, suggesting a hurried attempt to obscure what lay behind. The effect on visitors today is unsettling. To stand in a hallway meant for oversight and press one's face to the glass, only to be met with a milky surface reflecting one's own outline. To imagine what the attendant saw, or rather did not see, on the night 52 men and women were wheeled away. Ward D, the overflow that wasn't, reveals itself not as abandoned space, but as a hidden chamber, a place still fed, still bedded, and carefully concealed. In its silence lies a kind of complicity, a room that held the vanished until the hospital decided to erase them from its walls, leaving only shadows on the floor and an observation window that sees nothing at all. The discovery of Nurse Lillian Crow's clipboard came by chance, unearthed not in a file room or office, but beneath the warped stair treads leading to the East Wing mezzanine. Workers renovating the hospital decades later pulled away the cracked wood and found it wedged in the shadows, wrapped in brittle paper as though hidden in haste. The board itself was a battered thing, corners dented, its surface marred by tea rings and the faint ghost of cigarette ash. Clipped to it were a handful of pages, yellowed and curling but still legible. Alongside them, tangled in the rusting clip, was a small black rosary, its beads dull with use, the crucifix worn smooth from years of fingers rubbing over it in silence. The pages revealed something far more unsettling than mere orders. At the top, written in Crow's neat, slanted script, were instructions for patient preparation, dosage levels, bed assignments, lists of names. The notations were precise, almost ritualistic, as if she had carried out the routine countless times before. Then came the final sheet, torn down the middle as though ripped away in panic. What remained carried a sentence that seemed to hang in the air long after it was read: "Prepare them quietly. The transfer will not harm their minds if—" The line ended there, abruptly severed, the rest lost to the tear. The unfinished thought, frozen mid-breath, only deepened the unease. Handwriting experts later analyzed the sheets and confirmed what the eye already suspected. Crow's script, exact and controlled, dominated the top half of the final page. But further down, in darker ink and a heavier hand, a second writer had added notes in the margins. Their letters were blocky, impatient, and the phrasing sharper: expedite, confirm sedation, no delays tolerated. The juxtaposition was startling. On one side, Crow's professional detachment, as if tending to routine hospital procedure. On the other, an authoritarian voice pressing urgency and control, its tone closer to a command than a clinical reminder. The rosary spoke of Crow's private faith, a quiet habit tucked beneath her stern exterior, but the pages suggested complicity or perhaps coercion. Did she write the orders believing she was overseeing an ordinary transfer, or did she understand that transfer meant something more permanent, something from which patients would never return? The torn note offers no answers, only the echo of a voice cut off mid-sentence, and the presence of a second hand on her clipboard implies that Crow was not working alone. Whether she was a participant or a witness caught in someone else's directive remains impossible to know. But the hidden clipboard, left beneath the stairs like a discarded confession, ensures that her name is forever tied to the night 52 patients disappeared without a trace. The first mention of Project Hearth emerged not from an official archive but from a single carbon copy of a memo tucked between two unrelated staff schedules. Its heading was terse, bureaucratic, but strangely evocative. Hearth, Orientation Trial, Non-Invasive Sensory Regimen. There was no hospital letterhead, no signature, only the faint impression of typewriter keys striking thin paper. The word hearth itself seemed almost domestic, a name chosen to reassure rather than alarm. Yet paired with the word orientation, it suggested something less comforting, a program with its own vocabulary of trial and control. The memo described the regimen only in vague terms: patient group exposure, sensory harmonization, and non-invasive. These were phrases carefully chosen, as if meant to soothe the eye of any auditor glancing too quickly. But the absence of detail is what made it so chilling. Who was selected for these trials? What did orientation mean in the context of a psychiatric hospital already burdened by secrecy? In other surviving documents from the same period, there are notes of patients receiving light therapy sessions, yet none are as deliberately obscured as those attached to the Hearth reference. When paired with period newsreel footage, the atmosphere becomes even stranger. Clips from the mid-1950s show beaming doctors in white coats leading patients into bright rooms, promising the dawn of talking cures and modern psychiatry for the atomic age. Voices narrate the optimism of science, assuring families that progress was being made, that suffering could be measured and managed. The footage is filled with the confidence of the era: smiling nurses adjusting lamps, patients laughing at picnic tables, slogans about innovation scrolling across the screen. But when cut against the brittle carbon of the Hearth memo, the contrast is stark. One world promised transparency and progress, while another hid itself in euphemism and shadow. Then there are the oral histories. A former intern at Briarvale, interviewed late in life, recalled whispers of the Hearth sessions. His voice, caught on tape, is fragile but steady. "They said it was like sleep, but bright," he murmured. Patients would sit for hours, eyes open but not seeing, as though watching something inside themselves. We weren't supposed to ask questions, just record their pulse, their breath. He admitted he never understood what they were being shown, only that some patients emerged calm, others shaken, and a few did not emerge at all. The name hearth implies warmth, safety, a place of gathering. Yet the traces left behind suggest something colder, a controlled experiment cloaked in the language of comfort. Whether it was rumor or file, the memo remains one of the few surviving fragments pointing toward an organized program at Briarvale, a trial that blurred the line between therapy and something altogether more secretive. The basement theater was not marked on any official floor plan, yet when workers pried open a rusted service door decades after the hospital closed, they found themselves in a room built with an unsettling sense of purpose. At one end stood a projector cage of heavy wire mesh, the sort used in institutions to prevent tampering. Stacked inside were 7 reels of 16mm film, each labeled in uniform type, Orientation Session 1 through Orientation Session 7. The reels were stored in tin canisters, their surfaces mottled with rust but still legible, the lettering too deliberate to be the casual notes of an orderly. The word orientation echoed the same language of the Project Hearth memo, linking this forgotten theater to the program no one was supposed to acknowledge. The viewing log, found in a warped filing cabinet pushed against the wall, offered a chilling glimpse of how the space was used. Patient numbers were listed neatly, followed by initials of attendants who signed off each session. The description was disturbingly spare. Seated facing wall. Duration: 90 minutes. Monitored pulse, respiration. No mention of content, no notation of what patients were shown. But one detail leapt out, an observation that the white plaster wall at the front of the room was marked with concentric pencil rings, as though someone had traced circles over and over until the surface was a faint target. Investigators wondered if the wall itself was part of the regimen, a blank screen transformed into something more hypnotic by repetition, a canvas for projection that was both physical and psychological. When one of the reels was examined under careful conditions years later, the images appeared innocuous at first. Still frames of patterns, geometric shapes rotating in steady rhythm, intercut with pastoral scenes of fields and trees. But the audio track revealed something more insidious. Beneath a recorded string quartet, bright, orderly, classical in tone, lurks a secondary layer, a low-frequency hum almost imperceptible to the casual ear. Audio technicians confirmed it pulsed at a rate close to the brain's natural rhythms during sleep, the kind of frequency often studied in mid-century experiments on suggestion and altered states. The combination was deliberate, soothing music masking something deeper, a vibration meant to work on the body as much as the mind. What unsettled researchers most was not the film itself, but the thought of patients lined up in that windowless room, staring at circles traced into the wall, while the hum threaded through their bones. To the outside world, Briarvale promised rest, recovery, and modern cures. But in the hidden basement theater, 52 men and women may have been guided somewhere else entirely, lulled into silence by images and sound, their names eventually erased from the record along with the sessions that tried to rewrite their minds. The story of Otto Gerber, Briarvale's maintenance chief, becomes stranger the deeper one looks at the scraps he left behind. Among the hospital's debris, investigators discovered a small folded map drawn on the back of a cafeteria menu, lines sketched in pencil with obsessive precision. It was not an official floor plan, but a janitor's route, a pocket guide Gerber had carried during his nightly mop rounds. Each hallway, stairwell, and service tunnel was marked with shorthand symbols: an X for loose tiles, a circle for dripping pipes, arrows denoting shortcuts that bypassed locked doors. What caught attention most were the faint dotted lines leading into areas never listed in the hospital's blueprints. These paths seemed to vanish into walls, then reappear in other wings, suggesting Gerber knew hidden ways through Briarvale that even the administrators never documented. His map gave the impression of a man who did not simply clean the hospital, but lived inside its bones. One detail led investigators to a particular corner of the East Wing basement, where Gerber had drawn a star. There, they found a laundry chute, its hatch secured with an iron latch that bore the marks of heavy use. At first glance, the chute seemed ordinary, a passage for linens and uniforms. But the inside surface was stained not with rust, as one would expect, but with streaks of iodine-dark, tacky remnants that had sunk deep into the metal. Iodine was common in medical wards for sterilization, but its presence here, in a chute supposedly reserved for laundry, suggested something else had been pushed through, something that required antiseptic precautions. The chute was wide enough to accommodate not just linens but bodies. The contents of Gerber's locker only deepened the mystery. Among oil rags and old boots, investigators found a flashlight unusually heavy for its size. The casing was lead-lined, shielding the bulb in a way that made little sense for everyday maintenance. Alongside it was a folded card, printed with institutional efficiency: evacuation east only. The card listed brief instructions, directing staff to move patients toward the East Wing service lift, with no mention of exits to the north or south. It was a directive written with chilling specificity, a plan for movement not across the hospital, but into one confined sector. The pieces, when assembled, sketch a portrait of a man complicit or trapped. Gerber's pocket map showed he understood Briarvale better than anyone. The iodine-stained chute hints at its use for more than laundry. And the evacuation card, tucked into his personal effects, suggests he was following orders crafted for purposes no ordinary maintenance worker should have been involved in. Whether he acted as a willing participant or an unwilling custodian, Gerber's route through the hospital is not just a path of mop water and dust, but a trail that may have carried 52 souls toward disappearance. Carl Voss had been a patient at Briarvale for nearly 5 years, known to staff and fellow patients alike as Radio Carl. Before his commitment, he had worked as a mechanic in a steel factory and spent his evenings hunched over a ham radio set in his parents' basement. Even inside the hospital, his obsession continued. Staff confiscated bits of wire and scraps of metal from him on more than one occasion, though he always seemed to find more. Attendants later admitted that Carl had strung lengths of copper from his bed frame to the radiator, claiming it helped him catch the air. His notebooks, some of which survived the purge of records, are filled with careful dates, call signs scrawled in block letters, and fragments of phrases copied as though he were intercepting transmissions only he could hear. Again and again, one phrase repeats across the pages: "Turn the faces." The meaning of those words has never been deciphered. Some thought it was nothing more than the broken refrain of a troubled mind, a meaningless mantra born of static and sleepless nights. But others saw a pattern. Carl logged the phrase most often during the midnight hours, always clustered around specific dates, nights when other patients reported strange dreams, or when the boiler hiss and power flickers were noted in staff logs. In one margin he scribbled, "They turn when the light hums." The connection seemed nonsensical until the discovery of the basement theater reels decades later. Audio specialists who reviewed the surviving hospital recordings noticed something uncanny. On one static-filled tape captured by a night nurse at the switchboard, a tone emerges at 2:11 a.m., the very minute the East Wing suffered its blackout. The sound is faint, almost lost in the hiss, but distinct, a low-frequency pulse that grows and fades like a heartbeat. When the technicians compared it to the hum embedded beneath the string quartet on the orientation session reels, the two lined up almost perfectly. The implication was startling. Carl may have been picking up not random interference, but the very frequency the hospital was testing in its secret trials. To illustrate the point, researchers conducted a reenactment with a restored 1950s radio receiver. They played the reel through a projector, letting its hum thread into the air. Slowly, as the circuits warmed, the radio crackled and then settled into the same pulse Carl had once written about. It was as though the hospital itself had been broadcasting into the night, and only Carl had been attuned enough to hear it. His repeated command, "Turn the faces," lingers like a warning or instruction, a fragment from transmissions meant for no one outside the ward. Whether he was delusional or accidentally tuned to the same frequency that swallowed 52 lives, Karl Voss heard something that left an imprint strong enough to survive even the erasure of Briarvale's files. For the families left behind, the first explanation was delivered with clip deficiency and a practiced calm. Letters arrived weeks after the disappearance, some typed on official Briarvale stationery, others conveyed in brief phone calls by administrators. The phrasing was almost always the same. Due to overcrowding, your relative has been transferred to another state facility better suited to their needs. The language was bureaucratic, softened by reassurances that care would continue uninterrupted. No addresses were provided, no instructions for visitation, and when pressed for details, officials cited privacy protocols and the difficulty of managing large-scale transfers. Families, already accustomed to silence from institutions, were expected to accept the answer and move on. But when relatives began writing to other hospitals, confusion mounted. Across 5 surrounding counties, not a single receiving facility confirmed taking in Briarvale patients during June of 1957. Administrators, some baffled and others clearly weary of the question, replied with the same denial. There were no records of transfer, no new arrivals matching the names provided. One superintendent grew so irritated by the inquiries that he underlined his response 3 times in red ink. "We have received no such patients from Briarvale State Hospital." The letters pile up like echoes in a void, each one reinforcing the absence rather than dispelling it. Transport records proved just as empty. State highway logs showed no convoys of medical vehicles, and local sheriffs confirmed they had not been asked to assist with moving patients. Trucking companies and private ambulance services denied involvement. It was as if 52 people had been promised safe passage, yet left no trace of ever leaving the grounds. The silence grew louder with every denial, a silence that seemed less like oversight and more like orchestration. Then, buried in a folder of surplus equipment orders, a single bus manifest surfaced. The page listed a chartered vehicle scheduled to leave Briarvale on June 14 at 3:00 a.m., bound for an unnamed destination. The passenger count noted 52 individuals, with a line for attending staff left blank. At the bottom, a signature confirmed the transport, an almost illegible scrawl belonging to a clerk named Henry Colfax. The detail might have passed unnoticed if not for one fact: Colfax had been dead for nearly 6 months by the time the manifest was dated. His obituary appeared in the local paper that winter, and his replacement had been working in the office since January. The manifest remains the only surviving paper trail of the alleged transfer, but its impossible signature transforms it from reassurance to accusation. Families who were told their loved ones were moved now know the truth. No facility claimed them, no record placed them anywhere. And the one document meant to account for them carries the name of a man who could not have written it. In place of clarity, the transfer story leaves only a riddle, and 52 lives erased into the space between lines. When the bricked arch in the sub-basement was finally breached, it revealed something that unsettled even the most hardened investigators. The passage had been sealed in haste, but with a kind of crude determination, layer upon layer of brick pressed into place, the gaps filled with lime that still bore the imprints of human hands. Dozens of palms, large and small, had been pressed against the wet surface before it hardened, leaving behind a gallery of prints frozen in white stone. Some were distinct enough to show individual ridges, the unique signature of flesh, while others were blurred, dragged as if the hands had not simply pressed, but clawed. It was impossible to say whether they belonged to the patients, the workers who sealed the portal, or both. What remained was a wall alive with human presence, a mute testimony of those who touched it last. Once the surface was cleared, investigators found markings hidden in the mortar lines themselves. At first glance they resembled careless scratches, but under direct light the shapes became coherent. Circles intersected by arrows, repeating patterns that spiraled into one another, and always at the center the same peculiar sigil, a shape like a key turned sideways, its stem broken into angles that led nowhere. The etchings were shallow, too deliberate to be random, and placed at a height suggesting they had been carved by someone kneeling, working quickly before the wall was sealed. No tools were discovered nearby, only the crude signs themselves, as though whoever made them was compelled to mark the stone even as the opening was buried. It was not just the visuals that unnerved the team. The air around the portal was noticeably colder than the rest of the cellar, the kind of sharp chill that prickles skin even in the middle of summer. Instruments confirmed a drop of nearly 10 degrees, but no draft explained it. More unsettling still, as the investigators leaned close to photograph the markings, condensation appeared across the surface of the bricks. The moisture spread in faint oval shapes, fogging outward as if someone on the other side of the wall were exhaling against glass. The outlines lingered for minutes before fading back into the porous lime. The Wall of Hands remains one of Briarvale's most disturbing relics. It is both artifact and message, evidence of hurried construction and perhaps desperate resistance. The palms pressed into lime suggest human presence, yet the breath-like condensation hints at something else, something that still lingers on the other side. What was sealed beyond that bricked arch remains unknown, but the wall itself seems to breathe, as though remembering those 52 lives and refusing to let them vanish without leaving their touch behind. The fragments that survived under the label of Patient X do not read like the file of any ordinary Briarvale admission. They were found scattered among unrelated records, pages sliced at angles as if deliberately destroyed, then accidentally overlooked. When pieced together, they reveal the outline of a man whose presence in the hospital was concealed as carefully as it was documented. His real name is missing, but several fragments confirm a background in mathematics, with references to advanced training at a wartime laboratory. One margin note even cites Los Alamos affiliation, a phrase underlined twice, as if the clerk who wrote it knew it was not meant to be there. What business such a figure had in a rural psychiatric hospital remains unanswered, but the surviving scraps suggest his stay was far from voluntary. At first, his notations echo those of countless other patients: withdrawn, avoids group activity, limited speech. But beginning in late 1956, the language changes. Subject indicates preference for arrangement of seating. One entry states. Another, more chilling, reads, seats arranged as he indicated. The handwriting shifts between different attendants, yet the tone is consistent. Patient X was not merely participating in sessions, he was directing them. Reports describe attendants moving chairs into configurations he drew with precise lines, circles intersecting at angles that made little sense for therapy but carried the rhythm of equations. His influence seemed to grow quietly, transforming his role from patient to something closer to architect. The most striking piece of evidence is a Polaroid photograph, tucked into a folder mislabeled as supply receipts. The image depicts the orientation room in the basement theater, but the chairs are not aligned in rows as in traditional sessions. Instead, they spiral inward, curving in a pattern that resembles a vortex, with the final seat placed directly at the center. No patients are visible, only the empty chairs, yet the photograph radiates an eerie sense of intention, as though waiting for participants to complete the design. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, is a single word: directive. The cumulative impression is that Patient X was never simply a man under treatment, but a figure whose mathematical mind was shaping the very structure of Briarvale's secret experiments. Whether he was coerced, delusional, or knowingly complicit remains hidden in the redacted pages. But the progression from withdrawn to directive suggests a transformation, someone once silenced finding a voice powerful enough to dictate the orientation of an entire ward. The spiral of chairs, captured forever in a single Polaroid, stands as the only surviving trace of his design, a geometry that may have guided 52 people into disappearance. In the days that followed the disappearance, The machinery of silence began turning with a speed that suggested preparation rather than shock. Superintendent Harold Brandt, the man who had presided over Briarvale with military discipline for more than a decade, announced his resignation just 3 days after the patients vanished. The official reason cited health concerns, but within weeks, he had accepted a position with a federal defense contractor specializing in psychological research. His move raised no alarms at the time. Administrators often transitioned into private work, but in hindsight, the timing feels less like coincidence and more like reward, as though he had simply been transferred from one assignment to another under the cover of bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the state announced an inquiry into the events at Briarvale. Families of the missing clung to the announcement with hope, expecting hearings, testimony, and answers. Instead, the inquiry swiftly consolidated, its records absorbed into a higher office under the language of efficiency. All exhibits, from staff statements to physical evidence, were reassigned to temporary custody, with the promise they would be returned once reviewed. They never were. Decades later, requests for access to those documents still meet the same answer. Records unavailable transferred. The trail ends not in a state archive but in a silence so total it feels deliberate. The paper trail contains one final, haunting clue. Among surviving shipping ledgers from the hospital, investigators found a courier log dated June 20, 1957. It listed several crates marked for transfer to Harrisburg, where the state offices were located. All but one arrived. The missing entry bore a number scrawled in pencil, a crate large enough to hold files and records. What makes it chilling is that the number matched the catalog entry for the 52 vanished patient folders. The log shows the crate was signed out of Briarvale's custody, placed on a truck, and accounted for until halfway to Harrisburg. There, the trail ends. No record of delivery, no signature of receipt, only a blank where accountability should have been. The crate disappeared as completely as the people it documented. Together, these fragments paint a picture not of bureaucratic confusion but of intentional erasure. Brandt walking away with a new title, the inquiry folded into silence. The evidence spirited away mid-route. It is as though the state and its partners closed ranks around Briarvale, sealing not only a hospital wing but an entire history. The phrase, temporary custody, hangs in the air like a cruel joke. For the families who asked questions, there was nothing left but form letters and unanswered phone calls, their loved ones buried not in graves but in paperwork that simply ceased to exist. The return to Briarvale, in the present day, carries none of the institutional order it once projected. The hospital is hollow now, its windows blind with grime, its halls echoing with the brittle crunch of plaster falling from ceilings. Yet, when a modern research team arrived with cameras and instruments, they were determined to measure the building itself, to see if the silence that swallowed 52 lives could leave behind a trace. They set their equipment in the East Wing, tracing the same path that the patients would have taken on that night in 1957. Where attendants once wheeled gurneys, tripods now stood, their sensors flickering green and red in the darkness. The team began by focusing on the power grid, attempting to reconstruct the blackout described in the hospital logs. Portable generators were brought in, connected to the old wiring. At first, the circuits sputtered with ordinary resistance, the lights flickering just as they had decades earlier. Then, when one of the basement theater projectors was restored and allowed to run its decayed reels, something unexpected happened. The hum of the machine matched the frequency of the generator's strain, two separate systems falling into rhythm with uncanny precision. Monitors recorded the alignment, showing waves that should have been random suddenly moving in sync. And in the silence of the sub-basement, the old iron gate of the tunnel began to tremble ever so slightly, vibrating in harmony as though responding to an unseen signal. The cameras caught what happened next in stark detail. The orientation room, long abandoned, still bore the faint concentric circles once etched into the wall in pencil. The team had dusted them lightly with chalk to make them visible, but as the hum of the generator and projector deepened, the chalk began to move. First, it loosened in tiny bursts, as though shaken by a draft. Then it lifted in curling whirls, drifting upward in spirals that defied the airflow of the room. Instruments showed no gusts of wind, no pressure changes, only the dust moving on its own accord, swirling in patterns that eerily mirrored the spirals of chairs captured in the old Polaroid. For a moment, the room seemed alive. The air grew heavy, charged, every sound dulled beneath the pulse of the synchronized hum. When the projector bulb finally burned out with a pop, the dust fell instantly, scattering across the floor as if nothing had happened. The team's footage, however, remains undeniable. Chalk rising against gravity, an iron gate shivering without touch, and frequencies aligning as though the hospital itself were replaying a night it never escaped. The return visit did not solve the mystery of Briarvale. It only confirmed that the building still carries its silence like an unfinished experiment, waiting for someone to complete it. The attempt to account for the 52 begins, inevitably, with the ledgers. They are the skeletal remains of Briarvale's operations, handwritten columns of names, diagnoses, and notations of daily care. Under careful examination, overlays of the surviving records reveal a chilling pattern. Each of the vanished patients appears once, their names written in the same steady script as hundreds of others. Next to some are final notes: improved sleep, responding to regimen, withdrawn but stable. Then, abruptly, the lines end. Where the following entries should continue, there is only blank space. In some cases, entire rows are excised, the paper fibers scarred by razor blades. The ledger becomes less a record of lives than a record of their removal, a document not of treatment but of deliberate erasure. When the names are read aloud, one after another, they form an unsettling litany. Ruth Delaney, the letter writer whose correspondence trailed off mid-sentence. Carl Voss, the radio enthusiast, his notebooks filled with call signs and the phrase, "Turn the faces." Margaret Doyle, 14 years old, admitted for seizures her family could not afford to treat. Thomas Gould, listed in some fragments as patient, in others as doctor, a man whose identity was folded and refolded until the paper tore. Each name should have been followed by transfer slips, discharge forms, or at the very least, death certificates. Instead, there is only silence. Families who pressed for answers were offered the same hollow phrase, state transfer. It was meant to suggest movement, continuity of care, a simple redirection in a system crowded beyond its means. Yet no receiving facility ever confirmed their arrival, no transport records survived intact, and the one bus manifest that surfaced bore the impossible signature of a clerk already buried in the local cemetery. Transfer, in Briarvale's language, became a word without destination, a word that explained nothing. As the narrator's voice lingers over the ledger's gaps, the final question is posed. If transfer means movement, then to where did these 52 move? The camera lingers on the blank spaces, the torn fibers, the places where names once were. It is not only the patients who are missing, but the records that proved they ever existed. The erasure is too precise to be neglect, too deliberate to be chance. It suggests not just disappearance, but relocation into silence itself. In the end, the accounting cannot restore them. The ledger, mutilated and incomplete, testifies only to absence. 52 voices once echoed in Briarvale's halls. Now they exist as blank lines and unanswered questions, their destination unmarked, their journey unacknowledged, their final chapter written in vanishing ink.